Jack, as you well know, and as Marcus has said, was one of the most versatile directors this country's ever produced. He worked in television, in cinema and theatre. He was a master of the single play, of documentary, of arts programmes, feature films and crime series. He was loved by actors, deeply admired by the technicians who worked with him. And this BFI season, which is now at midpoint, is a celebration of Jack Gould's outstanding work in television and cinema. And we've got a remarkable panel that will discuss particular facets of Jack's work and talk about their personal connections with him. We've also got a very eclectic range of clips from Jack's work, many of them introduced by Jack himself in the course of a talk he gave in 2013 at the Cinema Museum. Well, since many of you, and I think a large number of you, will just have seen The Naked Civil Servant, it seems sensible to start talking about that. And I'd particularly like to ask John a few questions about it. It was a famous, iconic film, a famous performance. John, was it an easy film to set up? I mean, was it one of those films that just happened like that, or was it difficult?
No, it was, well, yes, it was difficult. No, it wasn't easy to set up.
Right.
Yeah. It took about 3 years, as I remember. It all came about because Philip Mackey was watching me rather drunk, fooling around in Jerry's club. Mm-hmm. And he said, I think I got a part for you. So, and that's what it turned out to be. And when I read it, that's the best piece of writing I've ever read. Yeah. And, but it was difficult because Wardour Street had said, Wardour Street, that covers everything, said that they'd love to do it if we could get Jack LaRue.
Danny LaRue.
Yeah.
Really?
Which anybody who remembers Danny LaRue was the one who hung his tits up, you know? And he was absolutely the opposite of what Philip Mackey, the writer, would have had. Mm-hmm. And it was turned down twice by the BBC. And finally it was taken, though Jeremy's rather doesn't like me calling it a small television company, but it was actually quite a small television company, Thames. Where Verity Lambert and Jeremy were the incumbents. And I sometimes wonder, I think, where will you find nowadays a small television company with two people such as Jeremy and Verity, you know?
Indeed.
Everything was a rarity, and everything was just very kindly played into my pocket, into my hand as well. Not my pocket, the pocket was appallingly played.
I won't ask how much. There is a peculiar challenge for an actor, I assume, in playing a living character. I mean, how much was Quentin Crisp around when you were making the film? How much did you and Jack ask for him to be there or not?
Quentin was there but not that many times. I should think about, over the whole shoot, about 4 times, 5 times maybe. Mm-hmm. But very important questions were asked, like how camp were we allowed to be in the cafe? And Quentin simply looked very quizzically and said, "You can't be camp enough." Indeed, that's how it turned out. So it was a very funny and wonderful experience.
I mean, now this film, as we all know, and as the audience has just seen, is iconic, to use a very overused word. But I wondered if at the time, were you aware of its significance? I mean, it's a very interesting fact, isn't it? This was 1975. That was only, I think, 8 years after the decriminalisation of homosexuality in this country. Were you aware that you were sort of, I don't know, raising the audience consciousness about this subject?
Well, I was, because I'd been told by several people not to do it because I'd never work again.
Really? Jeremy?
It was 1985, and it was a breakthrough of a major sort. 10 years previously, on the This Week Current Affairs programme that I produced, we did 2 half-hours of interviews with homosexuals, one with men and another with women. They were all photographed in silhouette only. They were, it was supposed to cause convulsions that these programs should be shown. The management of Rediffusion, where I then was, and the people at the IBA had their doubts, but they thought them through and said, let's do it. However, they warned that telephones are going to be crowded tonight and tomorrow morning. No telephones. The next morning, I went to my office and I picked up the telephone, and a man ranted at me down the phone, do you know what you've done? In the film about male homosexuals, there'd been a very short sequence, less than a minute certainly, in a half light in a cafe in Amsterdam where men were dancing with men. And this guy rang me up, seething with disgust, and said, do you know what you did last night? Do you know what you did last night? Do you know what you did last night? I said, no, what did I do last night? He said, you told the nation that Amsterdam was the capital of the Netherlands. But, but it isn't the capital of the Netherlands. I just want to say about, so I knew, and it's quite interesting, it was bogus. It was bogus concern because every single British family knew and knew well who in their outer family, inner family, friends and circles was homosexual, and it was no problem to them at all.
Good. I just want to come back to Jack and his working relationship with you, John. I mean, just give me an idea of how Jack dealt with actors. Did he give you as much freedom as you wanted, as you needed? How did he work with you?
He certainly gave you every freedom in the world. But he'd be the first to put you in your place if you got it wrong. If your instinct was leading you down the wrong road, he'd be the first to say so. And he wasn't afraid to say so because it was all for the piece. Jack did everything for the piece. It was, you want to speak?
Yes.
We're here tonight to honour Jack.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And unreservedly, having seen that wonderful film, we can do so. However, other people were involved. First of all, Philip Mackey. Mackey wrote this marvellous script after seeing a series of 7 half-hour films, which I think must have been on the BBC, directed by Dennis Mitchell, about Soho characters, as I remember. And Philip looked at this half-hour film about, and one of them was about Quentin Crisp, and Philip looked at that and said, there's a film in that, I'm going to write it. So he gets enormous marks. He touted the script, as we now know it, up and down Wardour Street, from one television drama office to another. Nobody wanted to know. The BBC, and this is a bit of a mystery, and it may be that somebody here knows the answer to it, they were certainly shown it. And I gather that they didn't totally reject it out of hand, but they did absolutely nothing about it. So Philip brought it to Verity, and Verity read it and thought it was wonderful, came to me the same day or the next day and said, this is wonderful, read it, we must do it. And I read it and said, yes, by all means, let's do it. And she gets a big hello for doing what 20 other so-called creative executives in other outlets had refused to do. Right. And certainly, if I may, very briefly, I'd like to mention that the line producer credited on that role a man called Barry Hanson.
Barry Hanson, yes.
Yeah.
Died the other day.
Indeed, yes.
And yet, he did an amazing job because Jack was given 20 days, 4 or 5 day weeks to make that crammed movie, crammed with goodies. And he took 21 days to do it, and I'm sure that must have been partly down to Barry beating a path for him through the jungle. So I think we put what we had into it, and we got something utterly wonderful back.
Well, I hear, yes. I mean, it was obviously a great collaborative effort. I'd like to go back in time a bit, though, and just talk a bit about Jack's early work and show how he became the great director he was. And we're going to start the clips tonight by showing Jack's early work on the Tonight programme, where he progressed from being an editor to a director of short films. Many of those short films, as I'm sure some of you will remember, star the show's idiosyncratic reporters. But Jack, early on, was fascinated to illustrate social themes through observant, close-up camera work. And the best person to explain that is Jack Gold himself. So can we introduce the sequence of clips from the Tonight programme from the 1960s? Thank you. Tony, I wanted to bring you in here. I mean, do you feel that part of Jack's later success as a director of drama, the roots of that are to be found in his work in documentary? Do you think the one tradition fed into the other?
Good evening, everyone. Yes, certainly. When I first met him, I'd seen some of these films he'd done for Tonight and films with Wicker. And I thought he was filmically literate, but also his work had a lucidity to it. And so we sat down, had a chat, and I talked to him about the way I was hoping to shift the way drama fiction films were made, with the 16mm blimped camera on the shoulder, where the camera would follow the action and everything would be in the service of the actor. The actor would not be in the service of the technique. And as I talked, I saw his eyes light up, and he was just nodding and adding to it. So I'd been working on a screenplay with a new writer called Jim Allen about exploitation on a building site in Manchester called The Lump. And I asked Jack if he fancied it. So we went up to Manchester and did it, and he did a good job.
We're going to have a clip from The Lump very shortly, actually, but that's fascinating what you say, that you could perceive in Jack's work in documentary, the seeds of his work as a drama director. I just want to skip over in time for a moment, because Jack carried his interest in social issues through into plays, as we'll see. He made a play for today in 1972 called Stocker's Copper, which was based on the Cornish clay miners' strike of 1913, and it starred Brian Marshall, the late Gareth Thomas, and of course Jane Lapotaire, whom we're lucky to have with us today, and Carl Davis sitting next to me did the score for it. I'd like to talk about Stocker's Copper in a moment, but shall we just once again, can we hear Jack himself introducing Stocker's Copper and just explaining what the basis of it is, and then we'll talk about it. Jane, can I bring you in on this discussion as you were part of Stocker's Copper? How much for a start did Jack talk to you about the background? Did he encourage you to research it? Did you discuss it? The factual background to the story?
I was 26. It's quite hard for me to remember what seemed like another lifetime ago. I certainly knew about the history of the strike, and it was common currency on the set. I'd never done a film before, so it was the first time I was on location. And I thought all films were like this. I thought the affability of everyone around Jack and the willingness of every department in the film to jump and get whatever it was that was needed, and the respect that Jack had for actors, I thought that was always going to be the case. So really, for me, from then on, it was downhill all the way. What was particularly moving about that scene is that most of the crowd of strikers were the children or the grandchildren of the people who'd actually been on strike. Mm-hmm. And I have a very vivid memory of perhaps one of the best experiences I've ever had as a working actor, was that we filmed near Loswithiel. And for those of you who know about Cornish accents, you'll recognise that we all do Devon. A Cornish accent being particularly difficult. We'd done an afternoon shoot and we were waiting for nightfall, and we all had what in those days was a good BBC location dinner, which was really quite lavish in comparison to what you get nowadays. And the procession of strikers was also added to by a Cornish male voice choir. And as we sat waiting on the hills in Loswithiel for night to fall, eating our suppers, suddenly this male voice choir started to sing. And for 20 minutes, nobody moved. And you know how big a film crew can be. There must have been about 120, 130 people. They sang Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah, and The Lord of the Dance, and all those great stalwart songs of male voice choirs. And I realized later when I looked back that that was one of the biggest gestures of love that anyone could do for a director. They had no qualms about singing. And as I say, nobody moved. And that said everything about the love that Jack engendered when he was working. He never threw his weight around. He respected actors. He worked very closely. I'm sure your experience is greater than mine. I never felt, and this is some credit to a director, as we'll all know, I never felt that when he was directing me that I was being hauled out and made a fool of. It was done extremely sensitively, quietly. Most of the time he was happy with what we were doing. And that's one of the most memorable experiences of my life. That choir sang as a gift of love and respect for the man that Jack Gold was.
That's a very moving story, and it's a perfect cue to bring in Carl Davis, who of course supplied the score for that and many other Jack Gold productions. On that Stockers Copper specifically, were you using what, local music, Cornish music?
No, I was brought in for the drama. It was we decided it would actually be purely percussion. Mm-hmm. So all those thumps and bumps and hisses you heard were my contribution to it. But I've got a funny Jack story about all the thing, but my funny Stockers Copper story is that after it had been made, it actually, I think you told us that it had, or we learned earlier that Stockers Copper won a BAFTA, won Desmond Davis Award, BAFTA, etc. And I think, Denise, you must have been out. You must have been acting. Oof. Yeah, you must have been acting because I was asked to accompany. Jack asked me if I'd go with him to the Albert Hall to get his award. So I was his date. Okay, that was sort of fun, and Princess Anne did it, and there was it was pretty starry, the whole thing. They always are, and. Jack went and stepped forward and then got involved in a very longish, for the occasion, conversation with Princess Anne that no one could hear at all. But it was very talking. So he got back to the table and I said, "What did she say? What did she say?" He said, "I'm not telling you." And I thought, now there's the difference. He's grown up and I'm not.
I think we've very clearly established how much Jack was loved and respected by actors, by the crew, by the people who work with him. Your story about the spontaneous male voice choir outburst is very extraordinary. But I'd like to pursue Jack's fascination with social and political themes in his work. Tony mentioned The Lump earlier, so we'll come on to that now. And because that was a famous 1967 Wednesday play written by Jim Allen, produced by Tony, and dealing with a bricklayer, if I remember, who was sacked and then forced to take up work as a casual labourer. And Jack later went on to direct a political piece in a very different style, The Gangster Show, The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui, based on a very famous Bertolt Brecht play, also produced by Tony. You could hardly have two more contrasting works stylistically. And that's a point Jack makes in that same lecture we've heard from already, in which he introduces both The Lump and then The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui. So let's hear Jack and then the clips from those two works, and then we'll discuss them. Thank you. Tony, can we talk about both of those very different works? I mean, what is fascinating instantly about The Lump, this is 1967, I think, isn't it? 1 year after you've also produced Kathy Come Home with Ken Loach, and the stylistic similarities are obvious, aren't they? I mean, do you think Ken influenced Jack? Did Jack influence Ken? Or was it your influence that determined that?
Well, films are social achievements, and we all influenced each other, and we didn't count who was doing what to whom, really. Ken and I had got together while we were both working on the Wednesday play, and we didn't need to talk much because everything I wanted to do, I realised that Penny had dropped with him, and everything he wanted to do, he realised, God, I could do it with him. We just knew. So it was just an approach to filmmaking that we wanted to do, which just wasn't happening in dramatic fiction, certainly. Well, films were not being made then. Drama films were not being made then. In the middle 60s, it was the biggest professional battle I've ever had in my life, was to try to persuade the BBC to allow me to go on location with a film camera to shoot a drama film, like a little feature film, because they'd just built the television centre with bloody great studios and those awful electronic cameras that they wanted to do shiny floor LE shows with, and drama. And the last thing I wanted to bloody do was drama. And I'd been 10 years as an actor, and I hated the way actors were treated, and I hated the way films were made. I'd been in the cinema as an actor, and we just wanted to do it differently. And Ken was utterly brilliant with actors, as he still is.
But Jack's style was, in that film, is very similar, isn't it?
Well,
Again.
yeah, I could see in Jack's documentary work that he was one of us. And he jumped at this, and we went up to Manchester, and he got on well with Jim Allen, who was not the easiest man to get on with. And we were just like that. That's what he wanted to do. Jack was political. He was, I would say, he wasn't really left, he was leftish. But we didn't really fall out over it. But his instincts were good. Mm-hmm. His instincts for material were good, but above all, Jane summed it up perfectly. I won't try to repeat it. Everybody loved him. Mm-hmm. And he was a family man. And when he went on location, everyone there was family. And so everybody relaxed. Everybody knew they were loved. As well as being very well organised, everybody just wanted to give to the film. It was just Jack's hidden strength. Yeah. That was the ace he always played, and he couldn't not play it because that was who he was. But then in the 70s, I had this balmy idea. I'd had a love-hate relationship with Brecht for years, and seen the Berliner Ensemble when they came to London. And a year or two before, I think Michael White put on a West End production of Arturo Ui with Len Rossiter.
Yeah.
I had this insane idea of doing a film, because as soon as I saw it, I realised this is a Warner Brothers gangster movie from the 1930s. Clearly it was. And Brecht would have seen the Warner Brothers movies. I mean, he'd actually been in LA in the 30s. And I thought, we've got to do this. But the BBC budgets were very small, and there was no co-production money then. So here was I saying, let's do a film on a tiny BBC budget, which is a 1930s set in Chicago with a huge cast in London. And it was so balmy, I knew I had to call Jack. Not because Jack was balmy, Jack was the sanest person I've ever met. But when you went to Jack with an absolutely, possibly difficult idea, Jack's response was, oh, this will be interesting. You know, what fun. You know, he was a problem solver.
Yes.
And we both admired Brian Tufano, the DOP.
Yes.
So we got him behind the camera. And we all sat and watched Warner Brothers gangster movies. That was our preparation. And the BBC management was more amenable in those days, and I got permission to shoot it in black and white. And with a good BBC crew, we went out and did it. And they brought it in. Jack and Brian Tufano just did it. Now the casting, I won't go on for too long, but just the casting might be interesting to people. Jack said, how about Peter Sellers? And I said, well, we'll never get him, Jack. We'll be spinning our wheels. But of course, Jack the optimist. Mm-hmm. So I put feelers out, and Peter Sellers, the word came back, he was interested. So Jack and I went over to just outside Dublin, where Peter Sellers was living there for tax reasons. And we were welcomed and given lunch. And then we went into Peter Sellers' sort of study, and Peter Sellers acted out 2 or 3 scenes from Arturo, absolutely brilliantly. And he talked about the play very intelligently. He'd obviously thought about it. And we all shook hands at the end and went off to the airport, thinking, shit, you know, Peter Sellers, for a BBC fee. And then, of course, we heard nothing. And I thought, oh, shit. And I called and didn't get an answer. And in the end, of course, it dribbled away. Mm-hmm. But meanwhile, we were in pre-production and we didn't have a lead. So Jack said, how about Nicol Williamson? I've had him in, you know, I said, Jack, I have a history with Nicol Williamson. Nicol and I were contemporaries in the same grammar school in Birmingham. We were in school plays together, so I know Nicol. And I'm afraid the last thing we can deal with here is an actor pissing around and misbehaving, because, you know, Nicol, you know, wasn't always a good boy. And then I looked at Jack and I thought, who would play Jack up? I mean, nobody's going to take the piss with Jack. I mean, not even Nicol. Uh-huh. You know? So I said, okay, let's have Nicol.
And it worked.
Nicol appeared on the first day, line perfect, was gracious to everybody. He went through the whole shoot without the slightest problem. That's Jack.
And you. Well done, you.
Never heard about that. That's a definition of a really great director who could make Nicol Williamson, you know, behave with absolute precision and punctuality and everything else. Carl, we must mention your contribution to that film, particularly. Yeah. I mean,
yes,
you were there.
Brilliant.
They were shooting in 1930s Warner Brothers style gangster. You were then presumably providing music that was appropriately 1930s Warner Brothers style music.
That's my aim. That's sort of the center of my work. really, but that I sort of say, well, look, you're going to have, if it's set in 1930s, I mean, and a great deal of Naked Civil Servant is set in the 1930s, or certainly the makeup of the character, it's makeup, sorry, that you're going to have authentic props, you're going to have authentic costumes, accents, you're going to have enormous care about the visual side. The score in my thinking, has got to be related either in some way or another. In this case, I did mimic a 30s jazz band of the sort of the actual makeup of the orchestra. It had the harsh, it had the brass, etc., and enough of a budget to make a noise.
Right. How kind of you, Carl. It wasn't enough of a budget. I mean, he did it on
never.
threatens, really.
Sometimes it is. But the thing about it, which is characteristic of working in television, really throughout, is you never have enough time. You never have enough time. And Jack, in this case, wanted a lot of music, you know. So we were just pounding out this score. I mean, you know, just hour after hour after hour. And somehow after about, 7 hours of it, we sort of got to the end. And I thought, how did I do that? This is madness. And we all thought, yes, it's madness, but you do it. But so the score was really fun to write. And I took really as my model not American 30s jazz, which is, of course, to be pleasant and music, but rather the way contemporary music like Hans Eisler, for instance, Weil is already too nice.
Yeah, so
because the tunes are so good. But it had to be almost continuously dissonant.
Right.
And really hard to listen to, really a sort of pain to listen to. I tell you what, my reaction is seeing that. I want to see the whole thing. I'm dying to see the whole film now.
It does.
Ask Marcus, he'll find out.
Okay, Marcus.
It'd be fascinating actually to see, yes, Brecht on the British television screen, which is hard to imagine today, is it not? I mean,
yes, it's almost impossible. I mean, another reason I wanted to do it was that the BBC was doing its cultural best with the classics, which were terrible sort of rapes of great novels, like particularly Jane Austen, and the occasional Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. And I thought, where's Brecht? Brecht ought to be on the BBC. So we put it on the BBC.
I was in one of those Shakespeares. And Jack Gold directed it.
And I underscored it.
Okay.
Right.
I realise now he was like a fish out of water. We were in the studio. Mm-hmm. Nicol Williamson played Macbeth. I played Lady Macbeth. Mm-hmm. Jack indulged Nicol, who demanded that we had real blood. So there were trays of cat's lights in the wings. The makeup girls went berserk because blood doesn't look like blood on film. And I realised Jack had cast Nicol and me because really Shakespeare wasn't his thing. And it could hardly be called a socially committed text.
I don't want to digress. I don't want to digress into Nicol Williamson territory, but John, do you have Nicol Williamson stories since we're onto this?
Have I got Nicol Williamson stories?
Yes, everyone's now talking about Nicol Williamson.
I did, don't forget, I did the John Osborne.
Of course, inadmissible evidence.
Inadmissible evidence, and the curtain was brought down on several occasions. And the text was given to change. Uh-huh. Apart from anything else, he was at the same time, I might say, totally and completely brilliant.
Yes.
I mean, he was a staggering talent who was, heaven knows, I mean, what happened in his poor mind, I don't know.
But not the most reliable of talents.
And the other thing is, in Naked Civil Servant, you remember when I'm doing a sort of imitation of the art college principal, mm-hmm. and I'm saying, crisp, do this, do that, is a pure imitation of Nicol.
Of course.
Can I just add something there?
Yeah.
I didn't realise it at the time, but Nicol was not well. He had a very serious addiction. And I think Jack knew that Nicol needed, he'd played Macbeth at Stratford with Helen Mirren, and I have a feeling that Jack allowed the blood and all the rest of it because Nicol was struggling then, although no one would have known it. And I think in a way that was another example of Jack's huge humanity. I mean, he would get Nicol to play the piano and sing when we weren't actually shooting. We found a piano in one of the studios, and Nicol was a brilliant musician and a wonderful singer.
Tom Lehrer, wasn't it?
Beg your pardon?
Tom Lehrer.
Yeah. Well,
Yes,
also
same.
he did a lot of American
Yes.
kind of blues numbers. But I have a feeling now when I look back that this was Jack's way of caring for Nicol. He knew that Nicol could do it. He'd done it at Stratford. I knew that Jack didn't like being in a studio. It was evident. And we were with these horrendous electronic cameras and all the sets built to accommodate the cameras. And but I look back on that time in a way with more knowledge because I was older and I could see the kindness and the care that came from Jack to Nicol. I don't think I'm spilling any beans that aren't common knowledge about Nicol's illness, and there was never a day when he didn't cough up the goods. But to do a Shakespeare play in 5 days in the studio, admittedly Macbeth is not very long, but I had the same problem with Antony and Cleopatra when Jonathan Miller said, "Would you like to come up and have lunch in the canteen?" I said, "Are you kidding? I've just played Antony's death scene. How am I going to go and have lunch in the BBC canteen when I've got to play after?" Jack would have known about that.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to move us on, but there's a lot of other clips to come. Between The Lump and Arturi, Jack directed in 1970 a very significant Wednesday play called Mad Jack, which weaves the poetry of Siegfried Sassoon into a drama about the period of Sassoon's life when he refuses to return to the battlefront. It's a very powerful piece, starring Michael Jaston as Siegfried Sassoon. So can we just see the clip of Mad Jack? Tom Clark, the writer, as he was on Stocker's Copper, as Nat Crosby, I think the cameraman, Carl Davis, again doing the score. Jeremy, can I ask you about that? Is that an example, do you think, of Jack Gold's, what? Directness, straightforward realism? Jeremy?
Everybody was attracted to work with Jack, and nobody can say how much good he did over and above the things for which he was credited. For example, as I said to Carl tonight, when I was looking for somebody to write the music for The World at War, I bumped into Jonathan Miller and said, "Who do you think should do this?" And he said, "You should try Jack Gold. You should try Carl."
Yes, yes.
Jack Gold tells me he's very good. And so there it was. I want to make 2 tiny points, if you don't mind, going
Please.
back
Yes.
to The Naked Civil Servant,
Yes,
which I
of
think
course.
people should be aware of. The first is that the version of the film that we saw tonight, in some ways, is the original film. But the caption that appears after a few minutes on the screen, sexual intercourse is a poor substitute for masturbation. And Philip had made this point of going through the film and using captions to get him over jumps when he wanted to. The Independent Broadcasting Authority, led by its director, Sir Brian Young, who'd been headmaster of Charterhouse for 25 years and was known as Bum Young. He was BMW Young. He absolutely refused to allow that caption to be used. I mean, all of us were hurt by it, but Jack was more hurt by it than anything else.
Is it because he disagreed with it?
He wasn't prepared after 25 years of being a headmaster in a boys' school to advocate masturbation, since he'd spent most of those 25 years telling people not to do it.
Yet he was perfectly happy with, wasn't it fun in the bath tonight?
No, he was not. Oh, he may have been, but that was an atrocity.
That's
for which
a far worse line.
I think I may have been responsible, because I wasn't going to have the film banned, and I had to find some way of doing this. Verity Lambert went to see Young to say, look, come on. And she took with her Philip Mackey. Mm-hmm. And she said to Philip, now, Philip, you let me handle this. As soon as he sat down opposite Young, Philip launched into a tirade about you ignorant, stupid, hypocritical, regressive, and that was the end of that. So we lost that one. Yeah. And I had to fight for years until something like its 5th and 6th transmissions on ITV, I got them to change their mind. I wasn't going to show it on Channel 4 unless that change had been made. Now, the other thing about the film that we saw, I'd heard, and I want to make it clear that I think it was knocked over by how wonderful it was, but as several people here have pointed out, and as Carl confirms, the dub, the music, was absurdly loud for great chunks of the film, so that you could not hear the dialogue that the actors were uttering. And that is almost unforgivable. How they came to that point, I don't know. But the dubbing mixer, who's credited at the end, Freddie Slade, would never have let the thing through with the sound so much imbalanced.
Well, I'm glad you made that point, and I'm also glad you triumphed over Bum Young in the end. You know, you've got.
No, he didn't. Somebody else agreed.
No, all right, okay. I want to move on to a film which actually, another film of Jack's, which is called The Sailor's Return, which you actually commissioned, I believe.
I was sitting in a motor car coming back from Bologna, where Jack, for The Naked Servant, and Frank Satanovich for Beauty, Bondi, Daisy, Violet, Grace, and Geoffrey Morton had been awarded the Prix Italia, the first occasion that Britain won 2 Prix Italias in the same year. And I leaned back over the seat and said, and Jack was sitting in behind. Verity and me were in front, and Jack and a couple of other people. And I said, what do you want to do next, Jack? And he said he'd like to do The Sailor's Return, based on a story by David Garnett. So that happened. So I said, okay, do it. That's what happened.
Can we just see a clip from it, and we'll see Jack introducing The Sailor's Return, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. So, The Sailor's Return, please. Thanks. Carl, I'd just like to ask you specifically about that scene, because what is instantly striking, obviously, is the way the percussive beats of the anvil sort of, I don't know, seamlessly move into the sound of the drums. I mean, is that your inspirational idea?
It had to be. It was an inspiration. That's what was required.
I mean, but tell me how it was worked out. I mean,
I don't remember.
Oh, I see. It must have been built into the.
Well, I think it was the assignment. I mean, we knew. I mean, it's serving the film. Mm-hmm. It's doing what the film is asking for. Right. Basically.
Jeremy, your memories of that film? Are you very proud of that film?
Very proud, but I made a terrible mistake in telling Jack there was something he was doing that I didn't want him to do. And I've always regretted it. She ends up washing dishes. I think the sailor, played by Tom Bell, dies. I'm not sure whether we've forgotten quite how. Mm-hmm. And Garnett ends his novel with a dry line of commentary, as it were, which is not attributed to any character. And Jack recorded, I think himself actually, redoing this line, and I said, as sometimes happened, extremely stupidly, Jack, you can't, after 90 minutes of that, where the characters have addressed us directly, suddenly out of nowhere put a line of comment over the top like that, said, please, can we drop it? And we dropped it. But he was right and I was wrong. And that was often the case. No, not often, but it was sometimes the case.
Well, that's a very nice and honest admission of you, Jeremy. I'm sorry to keep moving on, but we still have another couple of clips to see. Since we're on to the Sailor's Return, it's worth reminding ourselves that Jack made a number of feature films, and we're going to see clips from 3 of them. And the first, I have to say, one of my own personal favourites in all his work, and that's a film called Events While Guarding the Bofors Gun, which is based on a play by John McGrath, set in an army barracks during the mid-1950s, starring, I'll leave you to guess, in case you don't know. We then see a clip from The National Health, based by Peter Nichols on his stage play, that uses a decaying NHS hospital ward as a metaphor for Britain, and that uses a parodic form of soap opera. And next we get a clip from The Medusa Touch, with Richard Burton as a man with murderous kinetic powers. And edited, the film was edited by the great Anne Coates, I believe is with us today. So,
Applaud for Anne.
right, there we are.
It's stunning.
So, let us have the clip. Can we, with Jack introducing, first of all, there's the Bofors Gun, and then we go straight on to The National Health and The Medusa Touch. So can we see those 3 films? Thank you. But just on, not finally, but on the Naked Civil Servant, I mean, it was appreciated as such at the time, wasn't it? Clive James paid that very moving tribute to it, didn't he?
Well, he did. Well, it was quite, as he was a very witty man at the time, and probably still is, not in a very witty situation. But and he said that The Naked Civil Servant was the best thing to be seen on television since the last thing that Jack Gold directed. And but what's very interesting to me is hearing everybody else's stories, because a lot of this you don't come across, you know, except by chance, or by such as this.
Yes.
And it's fascinating that we all feel pretty much the same thing, I think.
I think there was extraordinary concord, isn't there? And we haven't sort of pre-planned this quite
No,
evidently.
not
but
a word.
Not a word, no. But the same spirit is coming out of everything, every remark that everyone's made. What determined his choice of script, would you say?
I don't know. He's not here for me to ask. It's an interesting question, but I really don't feel competent to answer it. I'm sorry.
Choice of subject.
Yes, what determined his choice of subject?
He had to believe in the work that was suggested to him, perhaps the script that was put before him and so forth. What he wasn't prepared to do was to make films, because he was a good filmmaker, about subjects that he didn't care about. He made one mistake, which he confessed up to, apropos of that screening at the Cinema Museum, which was an amazing occasion. But somebody asked him to do a film about, which was called Escape from Sobibor, the idea that it would be, you know, he could make a film about a concentration camp or an execution camp, but, you know, the film was about a riot by the victims, by the prisoners. And try as he might, and he tried, and I thought it was made for American television, I don't know what they thought of it, but he knew that it was too sort of simplistic and too sort of generalized for what he wanted to do. Whereas I think over and over again, so that he chose not to go to Hollywood and to stay where he had his choice of subjects. And I think that one of the most extraordinary things about him is that if you took 50 of his films, each of them might be different, and yet each of them had his mark imprinted on them, because if he believed in it, he did it. And boy, should we be grateful for that.
Well, I don't think Green would be his favourite chap. Jack's politics were social democrat, sort of Labour politics, but and he was a reformist. But his politics were based on caring for people and fairness.
Quite right.
And in a great sort of noble British tradition. And so he would be horrified not just about BHS, but he'd be horrified about all sorts of things that are happening now. And the exploitation that we showed on building sites in 1967, where any militant was blacklisted and couldn't get work anywhere, has only recently come to light and been stopped, if it has been stopped. This went on for a very long time. So Jack really wouldn't have approved any more than any of us do here.
Jeremy wanted to come
Well,
in.
I just want to say that I don't see how it can be separated from his work and what he achieved, but far and away the most important thing in Jack's life was his family. And Denise can take a big bow for that loving support she gave him for all the years of his career, except that the single thing that mattered to him most, I only found out at the funeral and thereabouts, was tennis on Sundays.
I know we've got some of his tennis partners in the room, actually, here today.
No, I consider myself to be a victim of other people's imagination. So I never had, I can't claim the courage nor the expertise of choosing anything clever for myself. But these things came, and I don't know, they came along.
Because you're a good actor, you silly idiot.
May I just say one thing,
Just in addition to what Jeremy's just said. I was planning a film for the cinema with Jack at some point, and it never got made, like most of them never get made. And there was a chance of getting some finance for it. And I said to Jack, there's a meeting Saturday afternoon with this financier. I'll meet you. He said, I'm not coming. I said, Jack, this is a real chance to get this made. He said, I'm not coming. He said, I'll take my kids swimming Saturdays. I'm not coming. Now, that's Jack getting his priorities right.
Mm-hmm.
But that is the secret of Jack as a director. That was his hidden strength. At the level of work we're privileged to inhabit, all sorts of technical accomplishment are givens. All sorts of talent, in a way, are givens. I hadn't been in this business for very long before I realized what mattered was who the person is. It's who they bring of themselves. This is true of actors, of DOPs, of directors, and of course of writers. And what Jack brought of himself was that. And that's why we love him. It's simple.